Welcome to Retro Reads, where timeless mysteries come to life. Today, a new case awaits, full of twists, secrets, and thrilling revelations. Settle in, relax, and let the adventure begin. Let us know in the comments where you're listening from and at what time. Let's get started and dive into this unforgettable story. It is a rare event in the annals of breakfast at Nero Wolfe's brownstone when a man who consumes his eggs with ecclesiastical solemnity pronounces judgment with nothing short of condemnation. That morning, he pushed the plate away with such icy disdain that even the orchids in the adjacent room might have trembled if they'd had ears. "I regret to inform you, Fritz," Wolfe said, folding his napkin with monastic precision, "that this omelette is a miscarriage of culinary judgment. I was already 2 bites in, not bad, maybe a touch soft in the center, but hardly criminal." Fritz stood frozen by the sideboard, his face pale, as the eggs that had moments earlier been whisked to death in his copper bowl. "Monsieur Wolfe," he said, with the edge of a Swiss-tinged tremor. "I followed the exact process, the same eggs as always, the butter from Madame Riker's farm. No," Wolfe interrupted. "The eggs are not the same. Or if they are, then my tongue is no longer mine. Either hypothesis is intolerable." He rose, slowly, like a battleship easing out of dry dock, and left the table, brushing past me with a grunt. "You're sure this isn't one of your temporary spells of palate melancholy?" I asked, mostly for Fritz's sake. He looked as though someone had slapped him with a trout. Wolfe didn't dignify it with a reply. He simply vanished into the orchid room, leaving the door open behind him, a signal of agitation, if ever there was one. I finished my eggs and coffee out of both respect and hunger before retreating to the office. Fritz followed me in with a kind of anxious deference, his white apron clutched like a towel of surrender. "Archie," he said in a low voice, "there is something wrong with the eggs. I've noticed it myself for several days now. The texture, they don't behave properly in the pan. They curdle unevenly. It's as if something has altered them." "Altered? You mean the hens have joined a union?" "No jokes, please," he said, visibly distressed. "These eggs are from Clara Heddle's farm. I've relied on her for years. Heritage leghorns, grain-fed, no antibiotics, but since last week the shells have been thinner, the whites looser. I thought it was the weather, or my technique. But then," he trailed off, reaching into the pocket of his apron. What he produced was a folded piece of paper, badly creased, with a smear of egg yolk on the corner. He handed it to me with trembling fingers. It read, in block letters, "Stop asking questions about the eggs, or your kitchen won't be the only thing that cracks." I blinked. This came with the eggs. It was tucked inside one of the cartons, yesterday morning. I didn't tell Mr. Wolfe immediately. I thought it might be a prank. But after this morning's outburst, I cannot ignore it. "Something is wrong, Archie. Someone is trying to frighten me." That was enough to make me put my feet on the floor. "Let me guess," I said. "You didn't tell Clara about this note?" "Number I've spoken to her only once this week." She sounded distracted, nervous. She's never been that way before. "Any chance you might be overreacting? Wolfe's moods are enough to unhinge a man." Fritz shook his head. "This is not about his mood. You know me, I do not panic easily." True enough. In the time I'd known him, Fritz had calmly prepared soufflés during gunfire and once deboned a goose while a client had a nervous breakdown in the front hall. I carried the note to the desk and placed it before me, leaning back in Wolfe's custom armchair. It didn't smell like a prank. It smelled like trouble with a farm-fresh stench. When Wolfe returned, 3 minutes past the hour, by habit, I handed him the note. He read it without blinking, then set it down precisely where he'd picked up his pen. "Pfui," he said. "Idiocy." "Sure, but threatening idiocy," I replied. "You may not care about your eggs, but Fritz does, and I care about Fritz." Wolfe closed his eyes. "Of course you do. And I, being human, am not entirely indifferent either." "That sounded almost warm," I said. "Feeling all right?" He ignored me. "I don't care to encourage this melodrama, but if Fritz's kitchen is to be held hostage by anonymous poultry saboteurs, we must intervene." "Meaning?" "You will go to the farm, speak to this Clara Heddle, examine the source." I raised an eyebrow. "Since when do you dispatch me on rural egg investigations?" "Since the eggs affect Fritz," Wolfe said, "and Fritz affects my breakfast." Which, by Wolfe's metric, made this a national emergency. I stood. "Do I get a travel stipend, or do I have to sell a chicken to pay for the train?" "You will be reimbursed," Wolfe said, already reaching for the latest issue of Gourmet, "if you return with answers." Fritz looked marginally relieved, though still pale. "One more thing," I added, tapping the note. "Whoever wrote this is either very confident, very stupid, or very desperate, which means they're likely to make a mistake." "Yes," Wolfe murmured, eyes on the page. "Let us hope it involves something more tractable than omelettes." He returned to his magazine. Fritz returned to the kitchen. I went upstairs to pack a bag and brush up on my knowledge of chicken breeds. If there was a riddle in a cracked egg, I intended to find it. I arrived at Clara Heddle's farm just before noon, which meant I'd had the pleasure of a 2-hour train ride, half a mile's walk through fields that smelled like overripe compost and the kind of sun that makes your collar feel like it's slowly strangling you. If I'd had any illusions about rural charm, they had evaporated by the time I knocked on her screen door. The woman herself opened it. Late 50s, maybe early 60s, though weather and work had done their part. Her eyes were sharp, and her voice had the cool flatness of someone who had spent a long time not needing to impress anyone. She wore jeans and a faded green button-up shirt with a streak of egg yolk dried on the cuff. "Clara Heddle?" I asked. She gave me a once-over that could have soured cream. "Depends on who's asking." "Archie Goodwin. I work for Nero Wolfe." The name got a flicker of reaction, more muscle than mind. "I've heard of him," she said. "He the one with the orchids?" "That's the one. I'm the one with the shoes that are now full of mud, but never mind that." "I came to ask about your eggs." She hesitated. A subtle thing, but enough to register. "You're from the health department?" "Nope. Private investigation, unofficial, off the record, strictly yolk to yolk." She didn't smile. "You sell eggs to a man named Fritz Brenner. He does the cooking for Mr. Wolfe. Lately, those eggs have been behaving strangely, not laying right, thinner shells, looser whites. Fritz is concerned." "I know who Fritz is," she said, folding her arms. "He's particular, but fair." "And you're fond of particular clients?" I said. "So I'll ask directly, has anything changed? The hens, the feed, the storage conditions?" "No," she replied, but it came too fast and too firm to be convincing. "Nothing's changed." I leaned casually against the porch rail. "Then maybe you can help me understand why Fritz found a threatening note in one of the cartons this week." Her body stiffened. "A what?" "A note, tucked under an egg, someone telling him to stop asking questions. Which is odd, because he hadn't asked any until then. You see the dilemma?" She didn't answer. Instead, she stepped outside and closed the screen door behind her. "Mr. Goodwin," she said slowly, "I've been running this farm for 33 years. I've dealt with foxes in the coop, poachers in the woods, and the State Department breathing down my neck over a mislabeled export. But I don't take kindly to being accused of threats." "I didn't say you wrote it." but someone is tampering with your eggs. Either you know that or you don't. If you don't, that's one problem. If you do and aren't talking, that's a much bigger one. Clara didn't blink. I've had some issues lately. Not with the hens, those girls lay true, but with people. Strangers poking around, asking questions about distribution. One fella even asked if I was still in contact with my old friends from France. I haven't been to France since the war. That'd be World War II. Is there another worth mentioning? I jotted that down. Any idea who the strangers worked for? She shook her head. Didn't say. Clean-shaven, no accent. Looked like accountants. That was interesting. Mind if I take a look at your packing shed? I do mind, she said, but I'll allow it. We walked in silence, the gravel crunching under our feet. I could feel it in her, the tension, the unspoken something. She wasn't lying, but she was leaving things out. Not to protect herself, but someone or something else. And as we reached the low wooden building where the eggs were washed and packed, I noticed something. A faint trail of red staining the floor near a stack of cartons. It wasn't blood, but it looked an awful lot like ink. Buck Tillis didn't wait for me to knock. He opened the barn door himself, shirtless, sun-reddened, and chewing a stem of something that looked like it had once aspired to be wheat. "You the fella poking around Clara's place?" he asked, with a grin that came preloaded with sarcasm. "Depends. You the fella poking fun at Clara's eggs?" That made him laugh. "Hell, I poke fun at everything she does, but not because I don't respect her, just because she makes it too easy. All that talk of heritage hens and sustainable nonsense. A chicken's a chicken. Unless it lays gold," I said. "You work for Wolfe, right? Heard he's got a kitchen fancier than a 5-star restaurant." "Only the food's better?" Buck smirked. "Well, you won't get any fancy yolks out of me. I run a clean commercial operation. No mystique, no secrets." "I bet," I said. "But here's the thing. Clara got a threat, in an egg carton, and now her eggs are acting strange." He raised an eyebrow. "Threat? What kind?"
"Enough to rattle her, and worse, Fritz." Buck tilted his head. "Look, I may not love Clara's style, but I'd never do her harm. Hell, she's been in this game longer than I've had teeth. But I'll tell you what, she's been tight-lipped lately, real cagey. Something's going on at that farm, and it ain't just the hens." "Such as?" he shrugged. "There was a fella up here about a month ago, real buttoned-up type. Asked a few questions about Clara's land, said he was interested in buying, but he didn't look like a farmer." "You talked to him?" "No, just saw him sniffing around. Clara chased him off with a rake." "And how do you feel about her little corner on the gourmet egg market?" "I feel like it's a gimmick, but she earned it. Her eggs are weird. Big yolks, odd speckles, all that. Chefs eat it up. She keeps to herself, and I keep to myself." He leaned in a little. "But if you ask me, and you did, someone's using her operation for something. Don't ask me what. I just know when folks stop looking you in the eye, it means they've got something to hide." I thanked him, made a note of his suspiciously theatrical innocence, and left him leaning against the doorway like a man in a cowboy movie waiting for the credits to roll. As I made my way back to town, I pulled the folded note from my pocket. Eggs, secrets, and now a woman with a wartime past who'd been approached by anonymous men in suits. If something was rotten here, it wasn't just in Denmark. It was sitting sunny side up in a carton labelled Grade A. Back at Clara's packing shed, I asked for permission to inspect a random dozen. She hesitated, then reluctantly opened one of the fresher crates. The eggs inside were speckled and off-white, laid out with care. I picked one at random, held it up to the light, and noticed nothing unusual, until I turned it in my hand and saw a thin red line creeping under the shell's surface. "Well, well," I said. Clara leaned closer. "What is that?" "That's what I'd like to know." The mark looked like a bleed-through from a stamp, except it was on the inside. I cracked the egg on the edge of a wooden crate and pulled it apart with slow care. Inside, floating in the albumen, was a faint thread of red, so faint it would be missed by anyone cracking eggs at speed. But there it was, a streak of ink just visible in the yolk's halo. Clara's face went pale. This has never... I held up a hand. I believe you, but it happened. Question is why? She took the shell halves and examined them with the intensity of a jeweler spotting a counterfeit. I don't mark these. No one does. I handle every egg myself. Well, someone's added an ingredient. I wrapped the shell pieces in wax paper and pocketed them carefully. I know a man, I said, who can analyze just about anything except his own salary. I'll send this to him. Clara was still staring at the broken shell like it had personally betrayed her. You don't think the hens? No hen I've met writes in red ink, unless your leghorns have taken up correspondence. I thanked her for her time and took my leave before she started asking questions I had no answers to. As I made my way toward the road, I considered the implications. Someone had gone to the trouble of tampering with an egg, delicately, precisely, enough to leave a barely visible trace of ink. Why? To send a message? To hide one? I mailed the shell fragments to Saul Panzer before boarding the train. I didn't trust the postal clerk's face, so I sent it registered under the name of an imaginary cousin. Wolfe trusted Saul more than most people he hadn't personally raised in an orchid tray. If the ink meant anything, Saul would find out what. By the time the train clanked into Westchester Station, I had 3 possibilities and 1 headache. Either Clara was being used without her knowledge, or she was playing innocent, or someone else was using her eggs for a purpose entirely unrelated to breakfast. All 3 options gave me indigestion. I got into the car and headed for the city, the carton of eggs beside me on the seat, and my brain sifting facts like flour. The road out of town was empty enough to make you suspect the locals had voted unanimously to stay indoors. I was driving Wolfe's Heron sedan, which he let me use only under circumstances he deemed tactically necessary. I suspected he considered sabotage of his breakfast one such occasion. I'd gone about 2 miles past a bend in the hills when a tan Ford coupe pulled out from a gravel side lane ahead of me. Nothing about it seemed odd until it started drifting into my lane, inch by inch, too slow to be casual, too deliberate to be coincidental. I tapped the horn once, no change. The coupe drifted farther, forcing me toward the edge. I touched the brakes and the wheel, calculated my odds, and gave them a generous margin by veering into a rough patch of grass just before the Ford stopped dead in the road, waited 3 seconds, and pulled away again like nothing had happened.
I watched it go, license plate dusted over, windows tinted darker than standard, no waving driver, no apology, just a quiet, purposeful exit. When I got back on the road, my hands were steady, but my thoughts weren't. Whoever that was, they weren't trying to kill me. Not yet. They wanted to see how I'd react, how close I'd come to panic. Maybe they hoped I'd crash. Maybe it was just a message. Either way, someone knew I was asking questions. Back in Manhattan, I parked the Heron with more care than usual and carried the remaining eggs into the brownstone like they were evidence in a capital case. Inside, Wolfe was in the plant room, of course, and Fritz had retreated into the sanctuary of his kitchen. I left the inked shell's duplicate fragments with Saul's envelope on Wolfe's desk, along with a neat note. Egg number 7, internal anomaly. Send results as soon as possible. That night, I lay awake, wondering what message someone might send inside an egg, and how far they'd go to keep it from being read. The next morning, I was halfway through typing up a summary of the egg developments, such as they were, when the telephone rang. It was the kind of ring that suggested it wasn't someone confirming a dinner reservation. "Archie Goodwin speaking," I said, with my usual charm. "This is Deputy Albright, Westchester County." The voice was as stiff as his probable haircut. "You were at Clara Heddle's farm 2 days ago." "Correct. What's happened?" "She was found dead this morning, blunt trauma, in her hen house." I stood slowly. "Details?" "Body discovered around 7:15 by a neighbour. She was struck in the head with a cast-iron egg scale. No sign of forced entry, no signs of theft, just her and the birds. And the birds didn't talk." "I assume that's meant to be humorous," he replied without humour. "You might want to inform your employer. We understand you were making inquiries." "I'll inform him, and thank you for the courtesy of the call." I hung up, then turned toward the dining room. Wolfe was seated with his daily arrangement of eggs, toast, and a glowering silence. Fritz was not in the room. "I suppose I should wait until you finish that yolk," I said. "You suppose correctly," Wolfe replied without looking up. I waited. He finished, dabbed at his mouth, and finally shifted his eyes to me. "Well?" "Clara Heddle was found dead this morning. Blunt object, an egg scale, in her hen house." He closed his eyes. "Pfui." Deputy Albright phoned. He was polite. Suspicious, but polite. "Who found her?" "Neighbour." They didn't mention the name. "Saul?" "Not yet. I figured we'd want to digest the news first, which in your case is literal." Wolfe didn't move for a moment. Then he pushed his plate an inch forward, a significant inch. "This is intolerable," he said. "First, my breakfast is ruined. Then Fritz is unsettled. And now a woman is murdered with an instrument of culinary measurement." "That's one way to phrase it." "You will call Saul, inform him of the development, and you will prepare a summary of your findings thus far." "That's already in progress. I also sent the eggshell fragments to Saul yesterday." He nodded. "Excellent. Instruct him to expedite the analysis." Wolfe rose heavily and headed toward the office without another word. The hen house had turned into a murder scene, and the only thing more fragile than Clara's eggs now was the mood inside Wolfe's brownstone. Fritz didn't appear in the dining room for lunch. I let it slide. But when dinner time arrived and I found the table set with a cold platter of sliced meats and bread placed there without fanfare, it became clear this was no passing lapse. I went into the kitchen and found him standing at the sink, staring at nothing. The stove was cold, the knives were clean, the copper pans hung without purpose. "I won't cook," he said before I could speak. "I gathered," I replied. "Want to tell me why?" "You already know why." He turned to face me, his expression drawn, his voice heavy. "Clara is dead. I knew her for 20 years. She sent me my first box of speckled eggs in 2004. I still have the letter, 'I'm sorry, Fritz. I really am.'" He nodded, but his eyes didn't soften. "Someone did this because she wouldn't play their game, and I, through you, pulled her into something dangerous. I cannot forgive myself." I shook my head. "You didn't pull her in. Whoever sent that note already had her in their sights. We just didn't know how deep it went." "She was a woman of integrity," he said. "She believed food should nourish not only the body but the soul. And now—" He trailed off. I waited, then said, "Wolfe knows." "He's furious." "He should be," Fritz muttered. "This wasn't just murder, it was defilement." I considered telling him that Wolfe, while displeased, was also now fully engaged. But Fritz wasn't looking for consolation. He wanted atonement. "I won't return to the stove until the person responsible is held to account," he said, straightening his back like a man giving testimony. "That's going to deprive Wolfe of eggs, you know." "So be it." "I just hope the killer understands what he's done," I said. "He didn't just commit murder, he ruined dinner." That earned me a faint smile. Barely, but it was a start. Back in the office, I found Wolfe seated behind his desk, fingers steepled under his chin, brow furrowed. The light was low, the room thick with the scent of leather, paper, and orchids drifting in from the corridor. "He's suspended operations," I said. "I surmised as much," Wolfe replied, "and we will respond accordingly." "How so?" "By demonstrating that murder, however cleverly scrambled, cannot remain unsolved, not when it interferes with my kitchen." "And if you knew Nero Wolfe, you knew that meant someone's goose was nearly cooked." The envelope from Saul arrived just after noon, delivered by a man I didn't know and whose vocabulary didn't extend much past "sign here." I signed, took the package to Wolfe in the office, and handed it over without ceremony. Wolfe didn't ask for an introduction. He slit the envelope with his gold-handled opener and drew out Saul's report as if he were extracting an orchid stem. He read in silence. His brow furrowed, then rose, then settled again, in a position I had come to associate with the mild pleasure of intellectual validation. "Well," I prompted, because someone had to. "This," Wolfe said, tapping the page, "is very nearly art." "That's what I tell myself when I fill out an expense form. What did Saul find?" "Observe." Wolfe handed me the report. I read, "Microscopic analysis confirms presence of synthetic red dye within yolk membrane, concentrated around a gelatin capsule the size of a pinhead. Under magnification, capsule contains a microfilm dot, standard Cold War encoding. Message structure resembles tactical cipher logs likely transferred via optical reader." "Well, well," I murmured. "An egg with a secret. That's not something you see in your average omelette." "Quite," Wolfe said. "It's a courier system. Ingenious, really. The shell is hollowed discreetly, the capsule inserted, and the contents resealed, either chemically or through a clever inversion process. It is invisible to the naked eye unless you're looking for it. And who inspects eggs that carefully? Fritz does, and now so do we. It's also clear now," Wolfe continued, "why Clara Heddle became a liability. She noticed something, perhaps not the specifics, but enough to prompt someone to act." "The threat note," I said. "Yes, a crude attempt to deter curiosity. But the true error was leaving it in a box sent to Fritz, of all people. That guaranteed scrutiny." "And Clara? Do you think she knew what she was shipping?" "I suspect she did not, but she must have sensed irregularities, men asking questions, eggs misbehaving. That, combined with your visit, no doubt sealed her fate." "Do we know what the message inside the egg said?" "Not yet. Saul has forwarded it to a contact with decryption experience." "Is that legal?" "It is necessary." I nodded. "So we've got espionage, a coded egg, and a dead farmer." Wolfe leaned back. "Yes. And at last, a motive that matches the crime in complexity. Are we telling the police?" "Not until we must. Clara is dead, that is their purview. But the egg, this is ours." And in that moment I saw it settle over him. The challenge, the scent of the puzzle. He was coming alive, not with urgency, but with purpose. The kitchen might have gone silent, but Wolfe's mind was now operating at full flame. Wolfe called me into the office that evening, after a long stretch of silence broken only by the shuffling of papers and a muttered curse or two directed at the limitations of state bureaucracies. "I have reconstructed it," he said without preamble as I entered. "Clara Heddle was a conduit." "You mean she was part of the ring?" "No," he said. "I mean she was the vessel, perhaps the ideal one. A respected, discreet supplier of high-end agricultural goods. Her eggs travelled only to an elite few. Restaurants, private chefs, clients whose kitchens are above suspicion. And Wolfe." He inclined his head. "Naturally. She didn't know?" "No," Wolfe said firmly. Not in any meaningful way. I suspect she began to question inconsistencies, the occasional irregularity in inventory, perhaps a damaged carton replaced by one she hadn't packed. Someone was using her infrastructure without her consent. But someone with access? Yes, he said, which narrows the field. Buck Tillis? Wolfe made a sound like a man considering whether to say perhaps or absolutely, and landing somewhere in between. He has the proximity, the motive, jealousy, opportunity, or simply mercenary interest, and now a very strong reason to panic. Clara was getting close, closer than she realized. She confronted someone. That someone, whoever managed the insertion of these microdot messages, decided she had become an unacceptable risk. The message in the egg, I said, was that the network was active. Precisely. And the use of Clara's eggs was no accident. The packaging is natural, the transport routes limited, and the customers predictable. Which means someone knew that one of the eggs might land here. Yes, Wolfe said, which makes us, temporarily, both nuisance and threat. Well, I said, it's not the first time. He closed the file on his desk. We must be precise. The person who tampered with those eggs has left traces. We will examine each contact Clara had, those who loaded or relabeled shipments, and we will watch who now tries to retrieve or suppress what's been found. I'll get Saul. You will, and you will also inform Mr. Panzer that our adversary is not merely a murderer, he is a professional. And Wolfe? He looked up, eyes narrowed. We are no longer dealing with a personal insult. This is a matter of strategy, and I do not intend to lose. That, I thought, was a statement best delivered from behind a desk, and followed by the methodical placement of intellectual traps. The kind Wolfe laid better than anyone alive. The letter was folded into thirds and tucked behind Clara Heddle's spice cabinet, which would have been a charming domestic detail if it hadn't been discovered by Deputy Albright during a post-mortem sweep of the premises. The officer, whom I'd come to think of as earnest but out of his league, sent a photocopy to Wolfe under the mistaken belief that Wolfe required transparency. He didn't, but he accepted it with the solemnity of a court summons. It wasn't long, 2 paragraphs handwritten in a strong, looping script, but it said more than most official files ever dared. I fear it's starting again. I recognize the pattern, the careful arrangements, the silence in the eyes of the men who smiled too much. The shipments are being touched, adjusted. I counted 31 yesterday, but only 30 made it to the crate. One was replaced. They think I don't see. If it is him, if B has returned, I must be careful. He knew how to hide things when no one would look. He used to say, the innocent always carry the most valuable cargo. That's what scares me most. I've played the innocent too long. I read it twice before looking up. Wolfe had already committed it to memory. B, I said, would appear to be our villain of the piece. Yes, Wolfe murmured, but also our link to a larger past. The quotation is telling. The innocent always carry the most valuable cargo. A maxim of espionage, he said. You mask contraband in the banal. Hollowed coins, newspaper rolls, children's toys, or, in this case, eggs. She implies familiarity, could be a code name. No doubt, Wolfe agreed, and likely one Clara encountered during her time in occupied France. We must consider the possibility that this ring, whatever its current incarnation, stretches back decades. Clara's past is not merely incidental, it is fundamental. What does that mean for us? It means, Wolfe said, that we must find B, not only as a suspect in Clara's death, but as the architect of the network that used her. The murder is a symptom. B is the disease. I'll get Saul digging, yes, and tell him to begin with Clara's wartime affiliations, resistance work, agricultural supply chains in post-war Europe. Any trace of B. I paused at the door. And if Saul finds him? Wolfe's expression darkened just a fraction. Then the eggs will be the least of his concerns. Wolfe's summons went out at precisely 9 a.m., and like everything he did, it was neither a request nor a suggestion. He instructed me to contact Buck Tillis, Clara Heddle's former delivery assistant, a young man named Riley Parks, and a woman named Veronica Watts, who managed distribution for a boutique grocer in Soho known to carry Clara's eggs. The pretext, of course, was concern. The reality was strategy. By 3 p.m., the office had been rearranged with an extra chair or two, though Wolfe made no personal concessions. He remained behind his desk, massive and still, while I played conductor for the orchestra of alibis. "Thank you all for coming," I said, adopting my friendliest tone, what I like to call the soft hammer. Mr. Wolfe prefers clarity to speculation, and we find it helpful to clarify certain matters when they begin to crack. That got a smirk from Veronica, a twitch from Buck, and a frown from Parks. "We understand," I continued, "that Miss Heddle's passing has affected each of you differently. Our hope is that you'll assist us in honouring her work and clearing up the circumstances that led to disruption." "Disruption?" Buck said. "She was murdered." "She was," I agreed. "But some disruptions are less obvious, like miscounted shipments, damaged cartons, eggs that don't belong in the tray." Parks, seated rigidly at the end of the row, spoke first. "I packed those crates myself. Always have." "I'm sure you did," I said. "But it only takes one switch." "That wasn't me," he snapped. I respected Clara. Respect isn't the same as loyalty. Wolfe cleared his throat. Once. That was my cue to stop stirring the pot and let the chef take over. "Miss Watts," Wolfe said, turning his gaze toward her. "You distributed Clara Heddle's eggs to high-end clientele. You noted, I believe, a shipment last month that was delayed and replaced." "Yes," she said cautiously. "The original was damaged in transit, supposedly. The replacements were different. Not bad, just off." "In what way?" She hesitated. "The speckles were darker. The shells had a faint ring around the equator. I didn't mention it because the chefs were satisfied, but I did wonder." Wolfe nodded. Miss Heddle may not have known her eggs were being altered, but someone did. "Mr. Parks, you've never noticed tampering." He shook his head, too quickly. "And you, Mr. Tillis?" Wolfe asked. Buck leaned back, arms crossed. "I wasn't near her crates. I've got my own to worry about." "Of course," Wolfe said dryly. "But you did visit her farm recently, didn't you? After business hours?" "She owed me a favor." "Indeed. You all may go for now." They left, and Wolfe remained immobile until the door shut. "Well?" I asked. "One of them knows, possibly more, but only one of them slipped." It happened 15 minutes after the room had cleared. Buck Tillis had been the last to leave, and he hadn't gotten far before I caught up with him in the vestibule, feigning a moment of bureaucratic confusion. "Mr. Tillis," I said, tapping a non-existent note on my pad. "Just one more thing. Do you recall if Miss Heddle ever mentioned anything about France?" His brow furrowed, and then his mouth opened a fraction wider than it needed to. "You mean the French message?" I smiled. "The what?" He blinked. "You said France. I assumed you meant... Didn't you say something about a message?" "I might have," I said casually. "But I don't remember using the word message." "What exactly did she say to you about that?" Look, I barely talked to her at all the last few weeks. We weren't on the best of terms." "Over eggs?" He looked down at his boots. "Among other things." "French things?" "I said too much," he muttered, and turned to leave. He did, at pace, before I could prod further, but not before I noted the red flush climbing the back of his neck. Back inside, I reported to Wolfe. A message, Archie? He asked, one eyebrow lifting. I never said it. He did. The French message, his words, which confirms he's either heard of the capsule or read it or placed it. Yes, Wolfe murmured. And the key is, how did he know? Clara never told him? I asked. Then he acquired the knowledge through access. That limits our field. He's panicking. Let him. It is useful. Wolfe closed his eyes. Saul? Already on him. I phoned him after the meeting. He's tailing Buck as we speak. Excellent. Then we wait, and we listen. And when Mr. Tillis cracks, he'll find himself over easy. Wolfe grimaced, but not from distaste. We were getting close. The morning after Buck Tillis dropped the phrase he wasn't supposed to know, Saul Panzer phoned from a pay booth across from a closed cigar shop on Amsterdam Avenue, a detail he included for no particular reason other than to assure me the line was clean and the location forgettable. I have a name, Saul said, and it's not in the phone book. That's my favorite kind, I told him. Go on. Buck Tillis isn't just selling eggs. He's also listed quietly as a minority partner in a firm called Alcyon Logistics. On paper, it went defunct last year. In practice, the office door still opens, the lights still work, and the garbage still gets picked up. Where? Brooklyn Waterfront, Warehouse Row. And the connection? The name Alcyon pops up in a 1998 customs audit. Mild irregularities, delayed manifests, switched shipping destinations, vague invoices, but the firm's founding address, Rue de Marignan, Paris, the old intelligence quarter. Charming. There's more. The import license was approved with a waiver, pushed through by a man named Baudouin, Claude Baudouin. That sounds suspiciously like a B. Exactly. And get this, Baudouin worked post-war as an agricultural attaché in the American Embassy, later transferred to private shipping and disappeared around 2003. Guess where his last known American address was? I'll bite. Same as Buck's warehouse before Buck bought it. You're making this very tidy. I thought you'd like that. Have you seen Buck near it? Yesterday. He unlocked the door, stayed 20 minutes, came out with a small crate. Didn't stop until he hit a drop-off locker in Midtown. I checked. Priority shipment, no return label. Eggs? Could be, or something that used to be inside one. I thanked Saul and hung up, then walked into the office where Wolfe was perusing The World of Fungi, Volume 2. He raised his eyes at my entry, but not his eyebrows. Saul? He asked. He's confirmed it. Buck's tied to a shell company with French intelligence fingerprints, and the man behind it once went by Baudouin. Wolfe's brow creased, mildly, meaning he approved of the development, but disliked the mess. Buck's not the mastermind, I said, but he's a courier. A handler, possibly a cleaner. And Baudouin? Possibly B or his ghost. Wolfe grunted. We have motive, method, and opportunity. What remains is confession. Voluntary or otherwise. Preferably the former. But I am not sentimental. Fritz is, I said. Wolfe's lips pressed together. Yes. And that was our next problem. That evening I found Fritz in the pantry, his sleeves rolled up, not for cooking, but for drying an immaculate glass he'd already dried 3 times. You've heard? I asked. He nodded. You know I listen. He's close, Fritz. We have the man. Wolfe's laying the trap. He set the glass down carefully. And still Clara is dead. We're not the police. Number, we're better, he said, and turned to face me fully. But if Wolfe means to stop halfway, if he plans to expose this courier and then return to roast duck like nothing happened, I won't be part of it. You're saying you won't cook? Not until the man who killed Clara is known and named and made to understand what he's done. You're a good man, Fritz, I said. I am a cook, he replied. But a cook is a keeper of peace. I cannot restore peace while her killer breathes easy. That wasn't something you argued with. I relayed it to Wolfe an hour later. He listened, unmoved on the surface. But I've known the man too long not to hear the small things. Very well, Wolfe said. Then he shall not breathe easy, not one breath more than necessary. He looked up. Archie, bring them back. Who? All of them, one final time. He picked up a yellow sheet from the corner of his desk and slid it toward me. At precisely 8 o'clock tomorrow, he said, they will learn the price of an egg. And that, I thought, sounded very much like a sentence being written. It arrived by hand, though not, I should note, a hand anyone recognized. A man in a charcoal coat with forgettable features delivered it to the front door and left before the bell had stopped echoing. Fritz retrieved it without ceremony and brought it to me in the office, where I was sharpening a pencil I didn't need just to have something to do, while Wolfe ruminated on microdots and French traitors. The envelope was plain, cream-coloured and unsealed. The note inside read, "The egg was just the start. Stop cracking shells or something warmer than yolk will spill next." It was written in the same block letters as the first message, but this time in black ink. No smudges, no flourish, just the kind of threat that pretends to be vague while hiding nothing. Wolfe, of course, said nothing for a full minute after reading it. He held it by the corners as though to avoid tainting his fingertips, then passed it to me. "Your assessment, Archie?" "Well," I said, "it's bolder than the first. Whoever wrote this thinks they're in a corner. That makes them either dangerous or stupid." "Possibly both," Wolfe murmured. "Which means they're accelerating. That is inconvenient. It also means we're close, or they think we are." "Worse," Wolfe said. "They think we've underestimated them. That is intolerable." I looked at the envelope again. It wasn't mailed. They sent someone. Indeed, which suggests proximity. To Buck? Or the network? "To us," Wolfe said with a grim finality. "They are watching the brownstone." "I can loop in, Saul, sweep the neighborhood." "Not yet. Let them think we are still fumbling. They are not merely warning us, they are afraid. It is better to observe fear than provoke it." I nodded. "Still want to bring everyone in tomorrow?" He nodded once. "That is no longer optional, but the circumstances now require a prod." "A prod?" "A fabrication," Wolfe said, folding his hands atop his stomach. "Something desirable enough to trigger movement, a lure they cannot resist." "Such as?" "A shipment, a final egg, one that contains the message they meant to intercept, or perhaps one they never sent. You and Saul will arrange it." "And where will it be going?" Wolfe allowed a small smile. "To the highest bidder, publicly." "And privately?" "To the one who comes running first." He leaned back. "Have Saul bait the hook. I shall supply the basket." If Saul Panzer ever got tired of being the most efficient man in Manhattan, he never showed it. I called him at 6:30, relayed Wolfe's idea, and by 9 a.m. the next morning there was a digital classified ad live on a niche forum reserved for gourmet ingredient collectors, black market botanists, and a few CIA retirees who apparently still had hobbies. The ad read, "Private estate lot offering 1 dozen heritage speckled eggs, vintage line, includes final coded specimen linked to Heddle Farm transfer, accepting offers by noon. Buyer must be discreet, proof of interest required." Below it, Saul had included a burner contact routed through 3 anonymous servers and disguised as a cheese supplier. The ad was live for just under 90 minutes before the first message came in, then the second, then the third. By noon, we had 8 offers. 4 came from accounts with no history. 1, marked GT, and traced via Saul's backdoor work, linked to a shipping firm once associated with Alcyon Logistics. "What did I tell you?" Saul said over the line. Bait a fish with the right stink and it'll bite. Did Buck bite? Not under his name, but an IP pinged from a diner near his warehouse. 10 minutes before his name popped up on the staff log, he was there. Wolfe, seated behind his desk with one of his less cooperative orchids in hand, listened with his eyes closed. "And the message?" he asked when I summarized. "Working on it, but they think the egg exists. They're coming for it." "Then we shall give it to them." "Meaning?" "Prepare the office," Wolfe said. "We host tonight." Saul had already arranged for a replica egg, matching shell, faint speckling, and an insert tube designed by a man who once built prototypes for Lockheed Martin. The capsule inside contained nothing but a single slip of paper with Wolfe's handwriting. "To break the egg is to expose yourself." When I handed it to Wolfe that evening, he placed it in a polished walnut box and set it on the center of his desk. "Now," he said, "invite them all. Mr. Tillis, Miss Watts, Mr. Parks, 8 o'clock sharp, the auction will begin." "And the lot?" He tapped the box. "This," he said, "is no longer bait. It is a mirror. Let us see who cannot look into it." At precisely 8 o'clock, the suspects arrived, as if summoned by a butler in a 3-act play. Buck Tillis, tight-jawed and too cleanly pressed for a man with a farm. Veronica Watts, composed in navy silk, her smile too practiced to be innocent, and Riley Parks, nervously inspecting the bookshelves as though one might whisper his alibi. Saul Panzer occupied the far corner of the room, silent and watchful. I stood beside Wolfe's desk, notepad in hand, playing the part of the curious stage manager while the real act began. Wolfe didn't rise, he never did, but he leaned forward with the faintest shift of his bulk and regarded the room like a man about to recite a scripture from a doctrine only he truly understood. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "we are gathered for the simplest of reasons, an egg." No one moved. Veronica raised an eyebrow. Buck shifted his weight. Riley swallowed. "Yes," Wolfe repeated, "an egg. Humble, fragile, circular perfection. And like all seemingly ordinary objects, it may carry more than protein and promise. It may carry secrets." He tapped the walnut box at the center of the desk, as if it might hatch on cue. "This egg," Wolfe said, "was prepared to match one recently found among Clara Heddle's stock. Inside it, a message, delicate, concealed, and damning. In another, previously tampered with, we found the same. Microfilm, encoded data, tucked into gelatin capsules and hidden within yolks as if smuggled through innocence itself." Parks blinked. Veronica remained still. Buck's nostrils flared subtly. "That practice," Wolfe went on, "is not new. During wartime, such methods were pioneered by agents on both sides. Clara, you see, was once attached to an agricultural aid initiative during the reconstruction of France. Her role made her useful. Years later, her eggs became useful too to someone else." He paused. "To someone here." Riley shifted again. Buck scratched his jaw. Veronica crossed one leg over the other, carefully. Someone saw opportunity in her reliability, her prestige, her discretion, a courier's dream. Except the courier underestimated her memory and her instinct. When she noticed irregularities in shipments, she made inquiries. She mentioned the word message. Wolfe's gaze landed softly and yet firmly on Buck Tillis. "And you replied with knowledge you had no right to possess." Buck opened his mouth, but Wolfe raised a hand. "Not yet. In due time." He tapped the box again. "This egg is symbolic, not merely of secrets past, but of a pattern revealed. Crack it, and you do not simply expose the yolk, you expose yourself." There was a long silence. Wolfe sat back. "Now, shall we proceed to the particulars?" With the room silent and the egg at the center of attention, like a particularly delicate bomb, Wolfe gestured toward me with 2 fingers. I opened a folder and began reading the outline Saul and I had assembled under Wolfe's orders. He had edited it for precision and venom. Point 1, I said. The shipment dated March 22nd included a tampered egg, not visibly but internally. A microdot message recovered and analyzed originated from a former French intelligence asset named Claude Baudouin, last known associate of Alcyon Logistics. Wolfe picked up. Point 2, he said. Mr. Buck Tillis is an undisclosed minority partner in a shell firm tied to Alcyon. The warehouse address he claims is used for storage also served, a decade ago, as Baudouin's American contact point. This is not coincidence, it is inheritance. Buck's jaw tightened. That's public record. Precisely, Wolfe interrupted, which makes it all the more revealing that you failed to mention it. Point 3, I continued. The shipment replaced, after supposed damage was not lost, but redirected. It ended up at a Soho grocer, Miss Watts's employer, under a false invoice. Wolfe turned to her. Miss Watts, you accepted the goods because they bore Clara's mark, but the contents were not hers. You noticed differences, yet you remained silent. Veronica replied, composed, because chefs weren't complaining. A choice of convenience, Wolfe said, and complicity. She held her posture. Wolfe moved on. Point 4, I said. Clara Heddle's diary, found by police, contained a direct reference to a man identified only as B. She noted that he knew how to hide things when no one would look. Wolfe's voice lowered an octave. That is not speculation. That is a signature. And when a man with access to inventory, motive for silence, and a known connection to Claude Baudouin reacts to the mention of French message before the term is introduced. He paused. All eyes turned to Buck. You implicate yourself, Mr. Tillis, not as the author of the scheme perhaps, but as its executor, the courier, the man who handled shipments, covered their rerouting, and, when Clara's awareness became a threat, silenced her. She confronted you, I said. She found the note in the egg. You panicked. Buck stood abruptly. You've got no proof. Wolfe raised a single finger. Mr. Panzer. From the corner, Saul rose. He held up a photograph, a scan of a crate Buck had delivered, labelled with a shipping number that matched a rerouted batch. This, Saul said, was sent 2 days after Clara's death. Same pattern, same tampering. Buck stared. You were trying to continue, Wolfe said softly. Even after blood had been spilled? No one spoke. Then Wolfe leaned forward once more. Confession is not required, not here. But you should know that the evidence has already been forwarded to the appropriate authorities, I added, as well as a curious collector in intelligence circles who still believes in Cold War codes. Wolfe nodded once. Your game, Mr. Tillis, is over. The shell has cracked. Buck Tillis remained standing, his fists clenched at his sides, and his gaze darting toward the walnut box on Wolfe's desk like it might explode. You don't know what you're talking about, he muttered. You're guessing. Wolfe, unfazed, folded his hands over his vest and regarded Tillis with the mild contempt he usually reserved for particularly clumsy metaphors. On the contrary, he said, I know precisely what I am saying, and you, Mr. Tillis, know it as well. I didn't kill anyone. You did not intend to, Wolfe replied. That is almost certainly true, but intention is no shield against consequence. You permitted Clara Heddle's farm to be used as a vehicle for an espionage operation. You tampered with her eggs, inserted encoded data on behalf of your former associate, Baudouin, or B, as Clara remembered him, and masked the manipulation with falsified deliveries. She discovered the anomaly and confronted you. She was going to expose it, Wolfe continued. To whom we do not know, but you couldn't allow it. So you silenced her? Perhaps you meant only to threaten. But a cast-iron egg scale is an unforgiving instrument. She was shouting, Buck said suddenly, his voice cracking. In the coop. She said she knew she was going to the papers. I panicked. I didn't mean to. The confession hung there, not shouted, but surrendered. Veronica let out a slow breath. Parks stared at the floor. Saul didn't blink. Wolfe didn't move. I see, he said, in a voice as cold as the marble on his desk. You panicked, and then you carried on. You rerouted one more shipment, believing the system could continue, that the infrastructure could outlive the farmer. She would have ruined everything, Buck muttered. All that work. No, Wolfe said. She would have restored something you discarded, decency, but you placed greater value on silence. I was protecting yourself, Wolfe cut in, nothing more. I stepped forward slowly and opened the file I'd been holding under one arm. Inside was a printed copy of the latest manifest, not the one Buck had signed off on 2 days ago, but the one intercepted before delivery. A manifest with a forged recipient, a false return address, a matching code, all linked to his login credentials. I laid it before him. Anything you'd like to add? I asked. He said nothing. He didn't need to. Wolfe leaned back as if concluding an exhausting course of instruction. It is done, Archie, he said. We have cracked the shell. There was one piece left, and Wolfe, as ever, had saved it for the coup de grace. He nodded at Saul, who stepped forward with calm ceremony and placed a small sealed envelope on the desk. Inside was a report from a lab that Wolfe insisted remain unnamed, though I knew it operated out of the back of a midtown print shop and could lift a fingerprint from a sneeze. Wolfe opened the envelope, removed the single-page summary, and held it aloft like an indictment. This, he said, concerns the replica egg we displayed earlier. A visual match to those Clara Heddle once supplied, but unlike those, this egg was constructed by Mr. Panzer and Mr. Goodwin, using a synthetic shell and a planted microcapsule. He set the egg itself on the desk, handled delicately, as if it still carried weight. During the brief intermission in which our guests were left unattended in this room, Mr. Tillis, seeking to confirm its authenticity, touched the egg. Specifically, he handled it near the equator, where the shell had been subtly roughened to entice inspection. Buck said nothing, but I saw the colour drain slightly from his ears. The shell, Wolfe said, was coated in a fine, transparent powder. Ninhydrin-based, it reacts with amino acids present in sweat. It lifts latent prints with near-perfect clarity. He held up the report. The thumbprint lifted matches a New York State agricultural license filed under the name Buckley C. Tillis. Veronica gasped, delicate, rehearsed. Parks blinked. Buck closed his eyes for a full 3 seconds, then opened them with the look of a man who had just lost his last defense. I had to know, he muttered. If it was real, if she'd kept one. You knew it wasn't hers, Wolfe said. You just couldn't believe we had one you hadn't touched. I added, but now you have. Wolfe glanced towards Saul. You may deliver the report, along with Mr. Tillis, to Inspector Kramer. Saul nodded. Veronica stood, smooth as silk. I presume I'm free to go? For now, Wolfe said, though your silence was profitable, I suggest you prepare for questions. She left without a word. Parks trailed after her, wide-eyed and speechless. When the door closed, Wolfe exhaled, deep, restrained. Archie, he said, you may now inform Fritz that breakfast may resume. I grinned. Sunny side up? He allowed the barest tilt of his head. As justice was, Mr. Goodwin, served warm. After Buck Tillis had slumped back into the guest chair, deflated, defeated, and no longer in denial, Wolfe set down the lab report as if it were a napkin he was finished with. The rest of us knew better. That page was heavier than lead. "There are two paths forward, Mr. Tillis," Wolfe said, his voice as measured as a Swiss chronometer. "The first involves officialdom, Inspector Kramer, federal agents, a Department of Agriculture tribunal, and, most likely, a lengthy and ignominious trial under espionage statutes." Buck blinked. His hands, which had once kneaded soil and egg crates, now sat limp on his knees. "The second," Wolfe continued, "is quieter. You sign a full written confession identifying your partners, outlining your distribution routes, and supplying every name, location, and method you've used since your partnership with Altion began. In return, I will ensure your surrender occurs without fanfare, no headlines, no cuffs in the press." Buck looked at me as if hoping I might offer some different deal. I didn't. Wolfe's voice had the finality of a courtroom gavel. "You'll still face consequences," I said. "But you'll do so as someone who told the truth, eventually. That's more than Clara got." There was a long silence. Outside the window, a cab honked on 35th. Inside the office, the weight of Wolfe's offer settled like dust after a storm. Buck nodded once. "Give me the pen." Saul produced a form we'd already prepared. Wolfe had expected this. I handed Buck the pen. While he wrote, slow and stiff, Wolfe turned to me. "Archie, contact Inspector Kramer. Inform him we have a courier with connections to Baudouin's network, and evidence enough to satisfy even his plodding skepticism. And if he asks how we got it?" "Tell him the usual," Wolfe said. Breakfast was threatened. I jotted a note for Kramer, then added, "And Fritz." Wolfe exhaled. "Tell him the kitchen is restored to its rightful order. The soul, as he calls it, no longer grieves." Buck finished his statement, set the pen down and looked up. "I didn't want her dead," he said, hoarse. "No," Wolfe replied. "But you chose her silence over her life, and now you will carry both." He rang for Fritz, not for coffee, for closure. And that, as always, was justice, the Wolfe way. Breakfast the following morning arrived with the reverence of a religious rite. The dining room was as it always had been, linen crisp, silver-polished, sun peeking through the east-facing windows in reluctant acknowledgement of Wolfe's rising. But the difference was in the silence. Not tension, not gloom, something else. Anticipation. Fritz entered with his usual dignity, bearing a tray with one plate. The aroma hit first, rich butter, a trace of Chèvre, a whisper of Gruyère. He set the dish down before Wolfe with the careful precision of a man setting down a crown jewel. "It is a 3-egg fold," Fritz announced, "with brown butter finish." I used the freshest batch from the local co-op, double-checked for weight and yolk tone. Wolfe regarded it without speaking. He picked up his fork, not with haste, but not indifferently either, and cut a clean edge from the center. I held my breath. So did Fritz. He chewed, paused, and then, without looking up, spoke the rarest of all declarations from that mouth. "It is acceptable." Fritz closed his eyes briefly. "Merci." "Do not thank me," Wolfe replied. "You restored equilibrium." "Someone had to," Fritz said. "After all that was broken." Wolfe nodded once, and that was that. The ritual had been completed, the balance of the house restored. For Wolfe, that was equivalent to divine order. I took my own seat and poured coffee. "Well," I said, "now that our eggs are uncracked and our conscience slightly less scrambled, may I ask what happens to the confession?" Wolfe wiped his mouth, set down his napkin, and reached for the small envelope I had handed him the night before. Inspector Kramer retrieved Mr. Tillis late last evening. He did not express delight, but he did take the report. I imagine he will enjoy waving it about like a saber once the headlines break. You think there'll be headlines? There always are, Wolfe said, even for chickens. And the agency? I asked. The one on the other end of the egg trail. They will bury it, Wolfe said, as they bury all things that make them uncomfortable. Espionage rarely ends with prosecutions. It ends with substitutions. Mr. Tillis will be one more ghost shuffled into a filing cabinet. Elegant. Number efficient. Fritz removed the empty plate. Wolfe did not resist the clearing of his table, another sign of rare internal harmony. As Fritz disappeared toward the kitchen, I sipped my coffee and considered the last month. A cracked egg, a farmer's murder, a smuggling ring hiding in plain sight. And, in the end, the simplest of victories, a warm plate of food that tasted the way it was meant to taste. "Do you think Clara knew what was happening?" I asked, mostly to the air. "She suspected," Wolfe said. "She may have sensed it all along, but when one's life is built around care, of food, of living things, it becomes difficult to believe in cruelty, even when it's staring through the coop door. You've become poetic. I abhor poetry. Then I'll rephrase. It's over." "No," Wolfe said, pouring a fresh cup from the carafe. "It is merely no longer our concern?" I stood and stretched, still smiling. "And Fritz?" Wolfe tilted his head toward the kitchen. "He's forgiven the world for now. That is sufficient." "Then I suppose all's well that—" "Archie!" I paused. "Yes?" Wolfe leaned back in his chair, heavy-lidded and entirely himself. "No pun, please, not even one involving yolks." I held up my hands. "Spoil sport." I made my way out of the dining room, but just as I reached the doorway, I turned back. "You know," I said, "you're not wrong. About Clara. About people who care. Sometimes they see more than they're supposed to. And sometimes that's what gets them cracked." Wolfe didn't answer, so I said it for both of us. "Never underestimate a cracked egg," I muttered. "Sometimes that's where the truth leaks out." And with that, the case of the coded yolks, the cracked coop, and the secrets buried in shells was finally closed until the next breakfast. Next.